summer intern here at the North Carolina Coastal Federation. So thank you all for coming out to our Coastal Speaker Series. We're excited to have you all here. Events like this are made possible by our generous members. And if you're interested in becoming a member, we have more information on the table. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Mike Mallin, a professor from UNCW Center for Marine Sciences.
Thank you. What I'm going to do tonight is first talk to you a little bit about tidal creeks in general, not only here, but also across the United States. To give you some characteristics of them, why they're important, and so on. Talk about pollution that occurs on them. Then I'm going to wrap up with some of the things that have been done in Wilmington that have been done to improve the tidal creeks. Tidal creeks can range anywhere from nearly dry on the outgoing tide to 2 meters deep or more in some areas. Some of the tidal creeks have been modified in the past. If you go up to Cape Hatteras National Seashore, there's a number of tidal creeks that pass under Highway 12 there, and some of them have obviously been carved out. Tidal creeks are really abundant in the east, from Delaware down to Florida and around Florida and along the Gulf Coast, because those are low energy shorelines. We don't get the big slopes from mountains, so to speak. There's some freshwater ones or ligahaling ones. If you go up the Cape Fear River, for instance, there's tidal creeks there that are freshwater. Marine, and this term euhaline simply means high salinity. You see these in remote salt marsh areas and mangrove estuaries, for instance. Barrier islands are good for that. And they're generally the least susceptible to human loading because they're the most remote. At UNCW, we've studied tidal creeks around here for quite a long time, and these are most of the creeks that we're most concerned with here, the city and the county over here. But these red dots are simply sampling stations that we have sampled a long time, and here's a couple of the fresher and low salinity creeks draining into the river, and these are the ones we call the mesohaline. Some of these freshwater tidal creeks I was talking about, if you're on a boat in the Black River, you'll see some of them along the side. You can pull off there and walk up them if you want to. So let's talk about pollutant sources to tidal creeks. Certainly lots of them around here, but I'll be going through these. Sewage spills, we've had, well, too many in the Wilmington area. Septic system leachate, some areas, not so much right around here. Other places, Brunswick County certainly, Florida's big on that, some of the Outer Banks areas. Stormwater runoff is a biggie that I'll be talking about, and you can get all of these types of pollutants running into there: nitrogen, phosphorus, fecal bacteria, herbicides, pesticides, metals, so on, from everywhere. Marinas, boats are on there. Sometimes they leak the various pollutants. You get springs in tidal creeks. They might leak nitrite in there. Maybe it comes from a golf course. Maybe it comes from someplace else. And then you get stuff that comes down from the sky. Atmospheric deposition could pollute tidal creeks. Unfortunately, we've had our share of spills, like I mentioned. They can be quite severe. Symptom of too rapid growth for existing infrastructure, for sure. I also want to point out that when you drive around, you cross tidal creeks, very often you'll see a brick building located near the corner there. That is a sewage pump station. It's located there because, well, it's lowland. Wastewater treatment folks, when they build their infrastructure, they like to take advantage of gravity as much as possible to get the sewage to the plant. So they do that, and of course the public road near there. So, but unfortunately, by being sited right there by the tidal creeks, if one of them leaks or if one of them has a big leak like we've seen, the creek is a mess. This is fecal bacteria. We measure the health of our waters for humans, for us anyway, based on fecal bacteria, fecal coliform bacteria counts. That's our standard down here for human contact, swimming, boating, that sort of thing. Okay, so down there 200, that's our standard. After this spill, 3 million gallons, the day after the spill, the levels of fecal bacteria in the waters was 270,000. What I'm trying to point out here is that even after it drops off, they don't go away. So some of them die off, but some go down into the sediments. They go into the bottom of the creek, and they like it down there because there's lots of organic goop for them, nitrogen, phosphorus, and they're hidden from the sun, which is a big enemy. But when it rains, they come right back out into the water column, and they'll hang out there for months. After the sewage spill there, about a week afterwards, we got over 5,000 down there in the sediments, and again, it rained, jumped way back up there, and it was elevated, at least in this, we stopped sampling after like 43 days, but it was still well above the background levels there. So that tells us that even considerably long time after a spill, if you got a kid or a dog that's wading, playing out in the waters there, they're going to be stirring up this bacteria there, and they got to cut or put their face or whatever they can get sick. Raw sewage has lots of nitrogen and phosphorus in there, and we had big algae blooms in the creek afterwards. This term BOD load simply means that it puts stress on the dissolved oxygen of the water. It's just organic, measured organic gunk that the natural bacteria out in the water, they eat it and they suck the dissolved oxygen out of the water column. Anyway, it has a big load, so it sucked the dissolved oxygen out, and we had lots of dead fish. Well, the net result of that, this particular spill, the intercoastal waterway, if you recall, was closed to swimming for 3 days, and the creek itself was closed to swimming and shellfishing for several months. But there's some pictures of that spill. You see the dead fish, big flounders and such, and then small fish, because it's a tidal creek. All this gunk from the sewage went out the creek, and it went out into the intercoastal waterway. Then the tide turned around, so it came back up, all this stuff, and it pinned all these fish up against the marsh, sucked the dissolved oxygen out of the water. We had big kill. Something else we discovered there, we find a number of dead and dying ducks and other waterfowl on the shores of the creek. They saw all these fish there, so they're in there and they're having a bounty. They're eating them up. But something that's very important is that humans and a lot of our domestic animals share a lot of the same pathogenic bacteria and viruses and protozoans. You hear the terms swine flu, bird flu, and so on. That's because they're translated back and forth between humans and these animals. So obviously it killed these birds here. Lots of areas I mentioned have problems with septic systems. One thing is, if you have excessive crowding of septic systems, that occurs down in places in Brunswick County. That's too much for the ground to handle. Can't treat it. The tidal creeks and the coastal waters get polluted by it. If you have a high water table, this is a coastal plain, you got high water tables all over the place here, so there's not enough space for the septic systems to treat the sewage. And the porous soils, well, we're on sand. You can't get much more porous than that. Now down in the Keys, for instance, they had this other topography, it's called karst topography. What that means, that the ground down there is riddled with these passages, so they put septic systems down there, and the sewage water basically just goes right through the few hours it's out into the coastal water. Charlotte Harbor, Sarasota Bay area, researchers have found that the outgoing tide will pull that polluted water right out into the tidal creeks and into the canals down there. Something that's closer to home here. On the Outer Banks, almost all homes are on septic systems on the Outer Bank. These are these tidal creeks / drainage canals, drainage ditches, whatever you want to call them. But that's an example of of one of these drainage canals, tidal creeks, and that's the first line of houses right over there on Nags Head Village. I mean, you just flip a stone right over to them. They all have septic systems. They have a high water table, sandy soils. That water, it drains right from there, goes right into these areas here. Let me explain what this chart means here. This is simply the time of year going across here, and this is the amounts, the concentrations of ammonia and phosphate, right, going up this way, and that is the water use, the amount of water use in the town of Nags Head. This broken line, it peaks out right here, in beginning of August into July, when it's jam-packed with people. And what we find out that in these tidal creeks, in the middle of summer, the concentrations of the ammonia and phosphate shoot way up in the middle of summer. That tells us those septic systems are not treating that ammonia and that phosphate, and a lot of it is coming right out into those creeks. Our concentrations of concern for fecal coliforms, again, the state standard is 200, and these are the average ones, well above that. And for the Enterococcus, which is another type of fecal bacteria, the standard's like, I think, 103, and it was way above there. Sewage pump stations, again, we find them along the tidal creeks, which is can be bad when a spill happens. And sometimes on the Outer Banks and other areas, sometimes the developments are given permission to build too many septic systems in areas where you already got the high water table and sandy soils, Outer Banks, and it's a recipe for the problem. Stormwater runoff, streets, parking lots, driveways, sidewalks, roofs, these are built upon areas and they're called impervious surface. So any kind of pollutant that's on these areas is subject to getting washed off as soon as it rains. And again, you got all these pollutants here, fecal bacteria, these suspended solids, metals, petrochemicals, nitrogen, phosphorus, pesticides, and so on and so forth. And you got runoff in agricultural stormwater too. As you urbanize an area around a tidal creek, the pollution in it basically multiplies. And agriculture does drain into tidal creeks in some areas. Again, back on the eastern shore here, where they have a considerable amount of row crop going on. You can see the nitrogen and phosphorus drains into the creek and causes these blooms. They also have on the eastern shore poultry production there, like we got inland here. Over there, it's right near the tidal creeks on the shore there. So that's a huge poultry CAFO over there. And then some spray and pesticides again on the eastern shore. And around our area, I put this in to point out that this fecal bacteria stuff there, that's probably the most widespread pollutant overall for our county. They come from humans, they come from animals, both warm-blooded animals, both. Okay. So
when you're doing
and you can't tell the difference when you're just doing the basic counts.
Okay.
To tell the difference, you actually have to do genetic tests, which are much more expensive, much more lengthy. Just some examples of stormwater runoff. Burnt Mill Creek, which is our most polluted creek in the area here. Of course, you've all seen or stepped in goose poop on the parking lot, dog manure. Every time it rains, the fecal bacteria in here is going to come out and run down into the nearest water body. I did a study some years ago. I was looking at the amount of closed shellfish acreage. They close shellfish waters when the fecal bacteria levels get too high. And the blue bars are the closed shellfishing areas this is the 5 most southern southeastern counties in North Carolina. And in red, that's the human population. So as more people came up there, more and more, and this stuff up there just tells us that's really, really strong statistical relationship there. We did a study some years ago that we were looking to see, well, what factors increase the amount of fecal coliforms? Again, statistics told us the human population, strongly related, percent of developed land, strongly related, and especially this impervious surface I was talking about. The more and more of that, the more and more fecal pollution we get. Some colleagues in South Carolina, they did a big study around tidal creeks around the Gulf of Mexico, and they found, again, as impervious surface increases there, the fecal bacteria counts jump up. In our tidal creeks, that human fecal contamination was detected at 18% of the sample. That's obviously from leaky sewage infrastructure or the septic systems that are remaining. We don't have a whole lot, but we got a few, and some don't work too well. Canine fecal contamination was detected at 23% of the samples. That is something we can do about. Everybody can pick up after their dog, and that salt would solve that problem right there. And that's ruminant cows or ruminants, deer and such. These were probably deer, maybe horses. We detected at 22% of the total samples. Just a little summary here on that impervious surface business. You know, if you've got a creek with less than 10% impervious surface coverage in its watershed, it's going to have pretty good water quality. Once you get between 10 and 20%, it's going downhill. Once you're above 20%, it's severely impaired. This data that we gathered, our friends in Charleston gathered and published some years ago in 2009, that did help the coastal regulations there. That was Senate Bill 1967, which caused a lowering from these impervious levels for future developments from 25% down to 12%. I was like this particular picture here. I took this in a parking lot in Wilmington, but this happens to be a drain that goes into one of the streams that goes into Greenhill Lake. But what you can see here, obviously you see the trash piling up on there, but you see this big swirl of these petrocarbons going down there and heading down to the creek. That also tells us that along with those petrocarbons in there, there's going to be fecal bacteria, there's going to be heavy metals and probably whatever, pesticides, anything that gets onto this parking lot, anything that drips from a car and so on goes down there. Okay, sedimentation. Sedimentation is the suspended dirt particles in the water. You see, it gives it the dirty color, and so turbidity is just another measure of that. But all this stuff runs off the land by stormwater runoff. Does lots of things. Could interfere with shellfish filter feeding. Shellfish want to sit on the bottom. They want to eat algae that comes by and so on. They don't want to be eating suspended dirt. If you're a finfish and the water's full of this stuff, you can't see your prey. If you're a plant you want to grow down there, it's going to interfere with your photosynthesis, changes the bottom habitat. The sediment particles, they stick. They stick on, or they cause these all these pollutants to stick onto the particles. So they're suspended in the water column, and they end up going downstream to the shellfish beds. We want to keep the suspended material out of the water as well. And this is just some statistical stuff here, but that tells us that fecal bacteria are really strongly related to this turbidity, and so is phosphate in all kinds of different situations we've found. So when it rains, we get big increases in all these different things there, the turbidity, the suspended matter, the fecal bacteria, phosphate, and so on. This is in Raleigh. It's it was taken just downstream of Lake Johnson. They were building an apartment complex there, and of course they got lots of red clay over there. That stuff's really light, and it carries these pollutant particles. And this stuff here actually drains into the Cape Fear. What this is here, this happens to be those creeks in Cape Hatteras that we study. BOD, this stuff here, as this goes up, the levels of the algae blooms increase along with it, and that's a real strong statistical increase. The more blooms you have there, the more stress you have on dissolved oxygen in there. So that's why we like to keep the nitrogen and phosphorus out of the creek, so these levels come down here. The nitrogen and phosphorus loading to these creeks can stimulate the toxic algae and potentially toxic algae. Anyway, so let me summarize a few of these things. Upland draining creeks are highly subject to runoff. The marine creeks, marine tidal creeks, least impacted. The freshwater and the oligohaline ones, they can be severely impacted, but they haven't been studied nearly as much as the ones like we have around here. Fecal microbial pollution caused by sewage leaks and spills, septic systems, and stormwater runoff. And it's highly correlated with impervious surface coverage. Results from some pollution reduction efforts in our local tidal creeks and estuaries. So over the years, there's been several attempts at pollution reduction, and various strategies have been used. These have been initiated by the city, the county, North Carolina Coastal Federation, Cape Fear River Watch, and other concerned citizens groups. Some of you in this room have been a big part of this. And we've been able to quantify results of some of these efforts. Looking at Howe Creek over here, you can see that, obviously golf course on landfall. Golf courses have lots of fertilizer. Fertilizer gets down into the creek, you have the algae blooms. Years and years ago, we were getting some, this is Howe Creek, Upper Howe Creek, we were getting some pretty big blooms way up here. And it was getting runoff from the golf course coming down here. What they do, most of what runs off these days actually passes through some wetlands before it gets out there. So it's improved quite a bit. I want to show you this. This is the chlorophyll measure I was talking about. This is the state standard. So bigger algae blooms over here. This is over time. What occurred here is that in a tributary outfall from landfall here, a barrier was built to retain the runoff water in a wetland on landfall. And the more the water sat there, the more the nitrogen would be removed through natural processes, would not get into the tidal creek. And these algal blooms went down. And this was 98 or so. And it was really, really nice. We had one big, huge spike over here recently in 2014, but by and large, it's really, really helped. So that was a good early effort there that helped. Burnt Milk Creek, as I mentioned, it's really our most polluted creek. It's polluted with chemicals, polluted with bacteria, has algae blooms, you name it. Years ago, back 2000, there was a constructed wetland built on Carr Avenue. Upper Carr Avenue drains College Road, drains part of UNCW, lots of restaurant areas up there, lots of parking lots. Now, that wetland, it was well intentioned, but it's really too small to treat the drainage area there. The gem as far as constructed wetlands goes in this area would be the J.E.L. Wade wetland, and that's on Hewlett's Creek. And it treats 50% of what runs into that branch of the creek and about 10% of what runs into the entire Hewlett's Creek. Important thing about this, there's plenty of space there. They built it, and they built it right. Funding came from the Clean Water Management Trust Fund, City of Wilmington, and New Hanover County. Let's have a look at why this thing works really, really well. One thing it's doing, you see all these different types of water plant here. And what they are doing, first of all, they're baffling the currents there, causing the water to slow down. And that water slows down, it deposits the suspended matter. Some of that stuff that's deposited is the fecal bacteria with it as well. And microscopic critters live among these plants, and they eat fecal bacteria. The roots of these plants here have bacteria that take nitrate and they turn it into elemental nitrogen and just send it off to the atmosphere, removes nitrogen. Transpiration, simply the act of the plant sucking up water and sending some of it out up to the sky there, that reduces the amount of stormwater coming in. So all this is a really, really good thing. This variety of plants here, it really helps clean up the water. Our goal is always to find better ways to improve the wetlands. This particular wetland here, what it does, it reduces the amount of suspended solids that come in here by 90%. And this is the densities of the fecal coliform bacteria. That's inflow 1, inflow 2, and that's the outflow. So you can see it removes a whole lot of the fecal coliforms, 93% and 90%. It's very effective, these high percentage removals of all of that. But what's also as important is that it improved the tidal creek downstream. I'm going to wrap up with some very interesting projects that we just finished analyzing right here. So over 2013, 2015, we did the scientific analyses. Along Banks Channel here, there's several stormwater pipes that run right out to the water. All too frequently, they have to post a notice, say, don't swim in here because the fecal bacteria levels are too high from the stormwater. The old pipe would come right out here into the water. Withers and Ravenel designed this thing, we call it an infiltration chamber. It's a metal chamber there with these perforations throughout it. Stormwater runs in here and goes into the manifold there and just settles out over time and leaks from here down through the sand up on shore, so it does not get out the end of the pipe. The important thing that it does is it reduces the total amount of stormwater that goes out the pipe into the sound. And we had these things all rigged up with instruments, and we were sampling and so on. The actual average flow, we call it load of stormwater going out into the sound from that pipe, comparing 7 storms before, 7 storms after it was installed, knocked it down 92%. Reduced the enterococcus by 90%, reduced fecal coliforms by 97%. So what happens? This stuff goes down into the sand. And then for it to get from there out into the channel itself, it has to flow through all of this sand. And in the sand, the fecal bacteria is filtered out. In the sand, there's going to be these protozoans that I've been talking about that eat the bacteria and so on. So it flows out slowly over time through the sand and then goes out into the bay itself. These are called curb cuts. That's the road runoff. Instead of it just going down into a storm drain and then going out here to Lee's Cut, which is where it flows normally, it runs off the road through the curb cuts, goes down into here, and from here it sort of filters out between this riprap and just filters out here into the swale. The height of the outfall grate is raised a couple inches here. So it gives time for all this stuff to settle out through the soil. So very little actually runs over the grate there. These are some more curb cuts that you can see. They're these little PVC pipes that look like standard storm drains almost, but they're pipes that just shoot through underneath the sidewalk. So you can walk the sidewalk and you're not going to come in contact with any storm water. Not too far from here, the Seawater Drive, which is right down there, drains part of the municipal area. Again, it used to just simply drain to the drain that goes out to Lee's Cut, but now it goes to this rain garden. The storm water comes out here and it just filters down through the soil, but all that stuff simply filters down through the ground. Before those curb cuts were put in, were running almost 600. Here they run a little over 200 afterwards. What it did here is it decreased the load of the stormwater going out the pipe to these cut by 50%, and reduced the intercoccus load by 28%, fecal coliform by 55%. Just some conclusions here. The IULA infiltration chamber did not reduce the bacteria concentrations, but reduced the stormwater volume by greater than 90%. Big load reductions. The ones in the municipal area, again, concentrations were reduced 55 to 70%, and then keeping in mind that it only treats 50% of the areas. Just in general, summing up all the stuff I've been talking about, protecting tidal creeks from pollution, sewage infrastructure, don't go cheapest bidder, you're likely to get the shoddiest work. Septic systems, sandy soils or these karst soils in Florida, combine that with a high water table, it's a recipe for fecal bacteria and nutrient pollution. Stormwater runoff, go big if you have the treatment area. Constructed wetlands can be highly effective if they're big enough. And these small targeted BMPs, infiltration chambers, curb cuts, rain gardens can be very effective on small scales, and combining several can successfully treat large scales. So thank you, I am done.